Not everyone who loves research wants to become a professor or work as a product developer, so what other options are out there? How about helping to coordinate the research that does happen?
I help establish research teams. I help understand what relevant opportunities might be for our community, what partnerships can be formed.
Meet Matthew Teegarden, senior researcher, and his role is providing strategic leadership for all scientific operations and communication in Ohio State's Food for Health Research Initiative. FFH is focused on helping researchers work collaboratively to discover new ways in which foods can enhance health.
Everyone eats. The diet has profound effects on health. It makes sense that diet would be a huge risk factor for disease.
Matt completed his undergraduate and graduate degrees in food science at The Ohio State. He's an accomplished researcher, science communicator, and host of Tasting Columbus and IFT's Next Food Disruptors podcast. So in this episode of the FoodGrads Podcast, you will learn why Matt decided to stay in research rather than attend medical school, what a senior researcher does, the difficulties of collaboration in research, and figuring out what you enjoy. Oh, and so much more. Let's get into this episode.
Matt Teegarden, I use he, him pronouns. I studied food science at Ohio State. I was undergrad through PhD there. So I was at Ohio State for about 10 years, really focused on the intersection of food and health in different aspects. But my training, at a basis is food chemistry. So I'm very steeped in analytical chemistry, especially when it comes to food, but use it as a tool to understand how food relates to health. After I graduated in 2018, I moved on to Abbott Nutrition here in Columbus for a few years. And then right when the pandemic hit, I ended up moving back to Ohio State to help lead our Foods for Health research initiative, which I currently work for now, going on 4 years.
Amazing. I definitely want to dive into what you're currently doing, but I do know that you had a little bit of an interesting story about how you got into the food science program, because I know it was not something that you just did right out of school. So would you be able to just a little bit elaborate on that for us?
Sure. I thought I wanted to be an architecture major. And because I don't know if your listeners or you ever played The Sims, I was like, oh, I
Yes,
love building
yes.
houses. I'm going to be an architect. So, and not to spoil the story, it is still an interest of mine, but purely from a looking at it point of view and maybe being in it. But I started taking architecture classes and they were kind of interesting, but I started putting like pieces of balsa wood together into a cube and like trying to divide that cube into so many shapes. And I was like staying up late at night in the studio trying to understand like what exactly am I doing here? And I said this isn't for me. So I went back and really took stock of what my interests were. I loved chemistry in high school. And at the time I was decided, okay, I'll go the other route and go pre-med. And I wanted an interesting major to, I want to be cool pre-med, And so actually one in our undeclared major program at Ohio State, my advisor basically suggested, well, why don't you consider food science? It has a lot of the prereqs for med school. But it tends to be fun and interesting. I hear good things about it. So I took one of the intro classes, had a final project about ice cream, and it was like, okay, I think this is it. Yeah, they sealed the deal there. But then I ended up really loving the research side of things in food science. So I'd done a couple of internships. I did a lot of undergrad research. And then by the time I was in grad school, I was like, I can't convince myself that I want to go to medical school. I want to do food science for the rest of my life. So it just kind of progressively made its way into who I am and what I love.
That's amazing. Wow. So you were still considering medical school by the time you hit grad school.
Actually, yeah. So I was a little bit behind in the application process for medical school because I decided, a year late or so that's what I wanted to do. So I was a little bit behind the application cycle and I was going to take some extra time before med school anyway. And so during my master's, I was like, well, why don't I do a master's? And that'll just be better for me to get into med school with that. And then as I was doing my master's, I was like, I love sitting at a mass spectrometer and looking at spectra. And I love the deep exploration you can do with research. And so that's really what drove me to stay in research and stay in food science instead of going the more clinical route.
That's amazing. And it's nice that you, again, when you mentioned that you did an undergraduate degree, pardon me, an undergraduate research project. Was that again an
Yes.
idea that you were, oh, this is going to look good going to medical school, or was this, I actually might like this. Should I try this?
It was definitely to look good for med school. So man, it really, yeah, I duped me. But I, yeah, I was trying to tick all the boxes, so even with all my classes, I was super aggressive studier. I wanted to be in the front row of like all my lectures, things like that. But yeah, as I started getting into the research, it really just showed me how you can take a problem and break it down into little parts. And I loved the chemistry of it. And so I sort of rediscovered my immense love for chemistry, and that is really what pushed me into being more of a food chemist.
That makes so much sense. I mean, I'm a chemist by trade. I did my undergrad in chemistry. I'm currently, well, now I like to think of myself as a phys chemist more than a
Yeah.
chemist. I don't really do the wet stuff anymore, but that's really good that again, one of the things that I try to point out with the show is that the food industry has a lot of different walks of life and that you don't have to know right out of high school that, oh, I'm going to do a food science degree. I'm going to go in and come into that field, and that there's really a lot of options. So, with that being said, so you've kind of still been in the same space. Like you're obviously not in medical school, but you're still doing something that complements it very much, which is being in that health space. So why don't
Right.
you tell us a little bit more about what that exactly entails?
Absolutely. And I'd say, it was really the perfect storm for me because my undergrad project, I worked on a soy-based functional food and had sort of my first exposure to food and health research where they were looking at men who had prostate cancer and to see if treatment with this soy almond bread would decrease, certain biomarkers that relate to prostate cancer progression. And, I did a very small part of that research project, but it was super interesting. And still thinking I was going to medical school, the next year I asked if I could coordinate another clinical trial that was being run out of this sort of collaborative group. Ohio State's kind of interesting because we have our like our comprehensive health sciences campus literally right down the street from our
Wow.
comprehensive agriculture campus. So we can have really interesting collaborations that stem out of that. And I really benefited from that. So my training as a scientist is incredibly interdisciplinary. I'm in the lab doing wet lab stuff, worked with human cancer cells for my dissertation. I coordinated clinical trials. I helped out with mouse studies. So, I feel like I was able to really be trained across many disciplines while still, getting that breadth, but getting some depth in the food science side as well.
Amazing. Yeah, I think it's so interesting because now I have become associated with thinking of food science as looking at it as just like studying it as a food item, studying it as a material. I'll run a characterization test and such. And I've almost sometimes admit I forget the person aspect to it. And it's nice that you really have that opportunity to combine the two because at the end of the day, that is where all these food things are going. They're being, ingested in somebody's body, and these are ultimately affecting it. So it's amazing that you have that opportunity to actually bridge that. And as well, sorry, is your role a postdoc or is it an actual separate role to a postdoc?
So my role is a little
Okay.
interesting, actually. So I'm not a postdoc. My title is lead for research strategy and development. I came in back to Ohio State as what was called a senior researcher. So kind of in the realm of like research scientist.
Hmm.
I guess it was kind of like not the best. It was an HR type of title that didn't necessarily make sense. But as part of my role, so I work on sort of the larger strategy for our initiative, and but at the same time, I get to participate in research. So I have principal investigator status. I'm not faculty, so I don't teach. I'm not purely focused on research, but I support research across the university that focuses on food and
Okay.
health.
That makes more sense. And how did you find out about this role?
Really good
Sorry.
question. So I will say the role as it currently is one that I was able to sort of carve out.
Okay.
But really I was recruited by my who ended up advising me in my final year of my PhD. So um about halfway through my PhD, my advisor at the time fell ill and had to retire. And so I was kind of in no man's land for a little bit, and ended up, I like to say, being adopted by Dr. Devin Peterson, who came to Ohio State from the University of Minnesota. And we were using very similar techniques. He's more of he does flavor chemistry, but from a untargeted chemical approach. And I was using very similar approaches, just with different questions. So he was really kind to adopt me, and one of the postdocs in the lab at the time, Jessica Cooperstone, ended up getting a faculty position at Ohio State as well. So I was co-advised by them basically for my last year or so. Long story short, Devin ended up getting appointed to lead the Foods for Health Research Initiative. And when that happened, he asked if I would be interested in coming back to help lead the scientific side of it.
That is a perfect storm. Indeed. That is this. I can only imagine the way you talk about it. It's so, oh, it moves so nicely and all that. But I can imagine in your final year having such an upshift with the PhD is a very terrifying experience.
It was. And luckily, having been at Ohio State for so long, there was a good support network around. So I never felt left in the lurch.
Okay.
But it was definitely a little bit of like, okay, well, what do I need to do?
Mhm.
But again, my advisor, who unfortunately has passed away recently, he was an amazing collaborator, Dr. Steve Schwartz. He was an amazing collaborator that really helped build these connections across campus, that helped carry me across the finish line for my own degree. So I owe a lot to him as well, because his own network sort of took us on as students and made sure that we were okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, one of the things you mentioned was for the Food for Health. Was that a recent addition to Ohio State, or has that been established for a while?
It's been established for a while. So Foods for Health actually started back in 2016. So when I was a student, it started,
Okay.
and I remember it coming to fruition. Ohio State, like other universities, people will have an idea of a new big initiative across the university to like spur research in specific fields. And so Foods for Health started as what was called the Discovery Themes at Ohio State. These were large faculty hiring initiatives. And so basically you would have different professors propose research areas to do like mass faculty hires in.
Hmm.
And so my advisor ended up winning the Foods for Health one. And so we were able to hire sort of a critical mass of faculty focused around this area. And then as the programs evolved, many of them have moved to be formal institutes at the university. So again, these are programs that sit above, like we're not within a college or a department, we're in the university's Office of Research. So we span the entire university. And
Oh,
so as the initiatives evolved, they needed programming to support them. They turned into more focus areas to really develop research teams in. And so that's where my role kind of comes in, is where I help establish research teams. I help understand what relevant opportunities might be for our community, what partnerships can be formed. And so it's fun because then we're more early stage science trying to see what new research can be done and how can we support that.
okay. That is so cool. Wow. Okay. Because I'm learning a lot because recently I've started to learn more about the United States and in the different universities. Because I'll admit, I'm from Canada. I know my like 7, 8 universities. I know Guelph is good for food science here. And of
Mhm.
course, there's way more going on across the world and all that. So this is a good opportunity for really me to learn a little bit more because I'm realizing there's differences.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, for sure. And like, as we look to other universities that, for instance, with Foods for Health, what other universities have this structure on campus? What makes them successful? What areas do they focus, and how is it run logistically in the university?
Mhm.
When you start digging into how universities actually work, it's honestly fascinating. Like the organizational structures, the way that funding works and things like that, that in itself took me a long time to actually understand, even though I'd been a student at Ohio State for 10 years.
I admit I've been at Ryerson now. My university's been changed. The name is now Toronto Metropolitan University. We were formerly known as Ryerson. So I've been there almost for 10 years as well. And I don't know half the structures like you're talking about. And it was only until recently with the open conversations with my professor that I'm realizing, oh, how funding really works. And it's not as simple as, oh, just pay us more. And I mean, that's a whole discussion on itself.
Oh,
but
yeah. Separate
but
podcast.
very, very much so. But regardless, so diving into that a little bit more. So with the food for thought, let's take it back to the food side with this, and let's talk about some of the key messaging that's important. So we've been talking a lot about this in general, but what is some of the key messaging that food for thought is food for health. Oh gosh, I'll let you talk. You know what you're talking about.
Well, we definitely like to play on words and use food for thought sometimes too. But when you think about it from a 10,000 foot view, and there's some publications that came out around 2017, like a Lancet article that shows that, poor diet is really responsible for more deaths worldwide than any other risk factor. And when you think about it, everyone eats. The diet has profound effects on health, so it makes sense that diet would be a huge risk factor for disease. But in order to understand this relationship on a more itemized level, I would say, and in order to understand ways in which we can use diet to improve health, we really need to take this interdisciplinary and comprehensive approach, from farm to fork to clinic to the community. We need to understand how we can not only improve foods and improve crops that make foods. We need to understand the workings behind precision nutrition. So how can we provide nutritional recommendations that are more precise to a person's biological state at a given time? And then we also need to understand what are those factors that cause people to choose the foods they choose, to crave the foods they crave, and how can we use science to improve dietary patterns through understanding those eating behaviors. And so those are sort of the three pillars of our initiative. It very broad,
Yes,
but
yes.
but we feel like Ohio State at least has, again, it's one of the largest universities in the US. We have this comprehensive campus that we have the resources, we have the people to tackle some of these large problems. And I would say the future of food, all in all, our key message is that the future of food and health needs to be informed by rigorous and sound science.
Yes, of course. And so with the initiative, so I guess you're actually, one of your roles is to try to actually get this research being performed and making sure that it's being done correctly.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of correctly, I leave it to the faculty expertise in terms of, propose what's best, but we make sure that we are focusing in areas that are not only work well with the expertise we have on campus or the partnerships that originate out of Ohio State, but also that these are areas that are of interest and fundable by federal agencies mostly.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the work that I do is to run our seed grant program. I treat them as strategic investments. And so I look to see, okay, what are the topic areas that Ohio State should be excelling in but are not? What are topic areas where we are excelling that we want to push forward? And what are areas that are a little bit more exploratory, but we seem to have the pieces and parts to make them work? And use seed grants as a tool to try and spur research in those areas. And all of this is done, of course, with peer review and things like that. It's not like I'm making the decisions myself, but I get to use my scientific lens to sort of decode these larger research trends and research needs and abilities into hopefully cohesive teams. And so the reason I say these are investments is because we hope that the teams are successful and then apply for external funds and bring more money into the university to do more research. And so we seed that research so that they can grow it into something bigger.
That makes
So that's like
sense.
one of the things we do. The other thing we do is provide a lot of opportunities for maybe serendipitous, organic type of collaboration to happen. for instance, we have an upcoming event that we're coordinating with our College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences, as well as the Comprehensive Cancer Center on campus, to look at connections between agriculture, food, and cancer risk, care, and survival. So we're trying to provide these opportunities to inspire people, to let them collaborate, understand what projects they could do, but of course, following that on with some seed funding as well. So wherever I'm trying to, in many ways, herd cats, right? Trying to get faculty to talk to each other and do research, because it is harder. It is more work to do interdisciplinary research, but it is a lot more. It can be a lot more compelling, I think.
I've learned that from my own faculty, that you would think if you're in a small science department that everyone does know each other, but then they don't really collaborate about what they're actually doing, because it's very easy to pigeonhole into one discipline, and sometimes even cross disciplines. So in my program, I'm actually in molecular science despite studying food science. So our program has everyone from biology studying cancer cells to studying cannabis growth to studying foods chemistry. Like, we're all over the place, and it's only through certain presentations that we've realized that, sometimes we actually have complementary types of research without having no idea, because unless you have those active conversations, they just don't get noticed, so to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been so fun for me to see that in my role here too. So our Center of Microbiome Science on campus is run by a gentleman, Dr. Matt Sullivan, who he is a microbiome scientist, but he's really more of like a geological microbiome scientist.
Okay.
But he is so interesting in his approach that, like, well, I've developed tools to ask the question in this context, but we can easily apply these tools to other contexts. And so we can look at virome, the microbiome, in humans too, using these same types of approaches. The sample collection might just be different. And so finding faculty members that are open to collaborating that way is the key, because that's really exciting, because they're the ones that can start to make those connections and make those links. And that's when you get to see a lot of the efforts kind of come to fruition.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsors over at the Canadian Food Innovation Network. The Canadian Food Innovation Network's Food Innovation Career Hub is a one-stop shop for food professionals, students, and employers. The community is home to anyone who's interested in a career in food tech or is actively seeking talented employees for their food business. The Food Innovator Career Hub lets you search job openings, access original content, and connect with a growing community of food professionals and mentors. The Career Hub is open to any CFIN member. A CFIN membership is free and gives you access to funding opportunities, new partners, and it is the most active food business community in the country of Canada. Learn more about how you can get involved by scanning the QR code on the screen or checking out the show notes to this podcast. Let's get back into the episode.
How are you learning about the different disciplines within it? Is it through a lot of conversations or just reading proposals, or is there something else?
I just know everything. No,
Good answer.
Yeah, it's a lot of reading and not being afraid to ask stupid questions, and definitely approaching conversations from a place of listening and learning more than trying to like solve the problem right away, or force the collaboration right away. So I feel like with this, I find myself translating between disciplines quite a bit. And I don't have to be an expert in every discipline. I think having a sound scientific understanding and, having a sound scientific background that allows you to at least read and somewhat digest papers and, get the gist of a field is really important. But knowing how to then translate, like if I get a horticulture professor and like a food science professor in the same room, they might not be talking the same language. Like one's more of a geneticist, one's more of a chemist. So like I have to try and keep my ears open for what the conversation is actually, like what the two faculty members are actually talking about versus what they're saying. So sometimes there's a little bit of translating that goes on, but yeah, I try and be informed. I try and read papers, and mostly I just ask stupid questions.
It's so interesting that you say translating between sciences, because most of the conversations I have with individuals is communicating to a broader audience, not within your own discipline. When
Hmm.
I say discipline, I know they're still, it's like saying this is chemistry and biology are the same. I mean, there's a thing, as you talk about this, it just reminds me so much as again, I'm in the molecular science program, and we have this problem where when we give presentations, we're like, well, I don't understand what was going on. That was a biology talk. I don't know the biology talks. I'm in chemistry. I don't need to know about this type of stuff. And this is a constant battle between us. And I can admit I'm on the side too, where I'm like, this is biology. I want to understand, but there's not enough time for you to digest, to give me your PhD research in a way that's going in depth enough that you're presenting it, but at the same time, I can understand it.
Right. Yeah. And I think you're touching on a really good issue is, even within the world of STEM and science, right? You need to, there are certain things that you can make more general in your communications, or, quote unquote dumb down, right? To make it translatable across fields. But I think it's really disappointing when you have the appetite to like sit down in like a mixed scientific audience like that, to sit down and learn about something, and then the person doesn't meet that challenge. Like that's such like, oh, that frustrates me. Because then you just get lost and things like that. But I do think, I don't know, I think getting exposure to other disciplines, like going to seminars across campus, have been super fun. Like as a student, I was doing that all the time. Going to nutrition seminars, going to grand rounds in the med school, going to like other talks that came across in different newsletters that just sounded interesting. And so I think if you do that enough, you learn the ropes of trying to digest information that's foreign to you kind of quickly, to at least start to understand what they're talking about. And if you don't ask a question, then that's fine. But at least you kind of went and expanded your horizons a little bit. So I do think, especially when it's more, mixed company in terms of different disciplines together, you need to still adjust your communication to a certain level so that it's understandable by a general scientific audience. But I think even being someone that's willing to accept that information is also a good like trait in a well-rounded scientist. And that not everyone is like that, like you said.
I like that. I could take this in two places because I know there's the whole science communicator route, which I know that's what you're into, and I will go to there. But I do want to touch, thinking back to our audience that's currently listening. When you mentioned that you were going to these talks as students, was this as a graduate student, or was it also as well as an undergraduate?
Mostly as a graduate student, I would say, just because I had the time, because, taking less classes, focus more on research, but could step away from the lab to go to these seminars. I remember going to some seminars as an undergrad, especially if like the talk was relevant to my research, or maybe someone in my lab was giving the talk or something like that. Um, but I don't know, my lab kind of had a culture of, pretty much every week we would go to the nutrition seminar. Um, and if someone that we were collaborating with was giving grand rounds, we would go there. And because my advisor had built up such a large collaborative network, there were just so many different, places to go and learn about stuff that I was never at a loss for seminars to go to, I'd say.
That's amazing. That's one thing that's really good about Ohio State. Again, coming back to mine, we have our course actually requires us to watch external speakers, and so we kind of were forced to do that, which I enjoyed listening to. But again, so many of the talks were so in-depthly to another audience that I always felt it was hard to follow. Then you get some really good ones, and it was just when they brought the language down just a bit, you're like, wow, this is amazing. Like I remember the one talk we were learning about materials for fabrics, which was really
Hmm.
cool, like smart materials and such. So I guess I was trying to bring up with the point as I spoke right now is that I think it's another good opportunity if an undergraduate student wants to be exposed to research. They might not know where they want to go after they graduate. Another good way is to view their school to see if there is talks that are available for external speakers. And I'm sure if it's most of them are open to all faculty wide, to the whole school, if I'm not mistaken.
Usually, I mean, typically, typically, yes. But I think you're touching on an important issue, especially for undergraduates. finding the right listeners to get on to, or if if you have a relationship with graduate students, they might be a little bit more in tune to what is going on seminar wise. But even a department, like if you're in a food science department, and even with you in your department, the topics that are going to be talked about in seminar, you don't have to look too far, right? If you're on your department's listserv, the topics are still going to be broad. So even starting there, where it's at least in a food science department, it's still going to be talking around a subject area that but it might just be maybe you're more interested in microbiology and the topic is more chemistry. But it at least starts to let you, again, build your understanding of science and how all of it's related. And it'll make going to other seminars in the future a little bit more approachable, potentially.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the stuff, like when you talk about going to like alternative materials seminars and things like that stuff is cool because it gets you out of your own field. You're like, wait, they're doing what? Like they're making a shirt that can read your heartbeat. Why? And how are they doing that? And how, like, I think keeps you curious as well.
I love your excitement and seeing you like just getting excited about the other disciplines of science, that it's not just I'm only food science, that's all I'm going to bother with, but getting excited about other things because it really broadens your horizons. And I can see that collaboration piece and how this has really worked. And one thing, science communication seems like it's been a really important topic for you for a lot of your academic career. And now it's even come to your own job. Can you explain a little bit about where that sense of excitement or that want to communicate more rather just outside of your research?
I don't know. I like thinking back to like growing up, I always enjoyed I wasn't like in drama club or anything, but I always enjoyed like making video, like whenever we would have class video projects, I'd always go above and beyond because I just thought it was fun. And I don't necessarily do that kind of stuff anymore, but I've always liked, in a way, communicating, getting messages out there, talking to people. I consider myself more of a extroverted introvert. I like my alone time, but I also really love working with people and helping them understand. I grew up watching a lot of the PBS shows around science. I loved Nova. I still love Nova, the TV show on PBS. But I've always just loved that stuff. And so I think now that I am a full-fledged scientist, having the opportunity to help people build their own understanding of the world around them, especially as it relates to food, is really appealing because there's a lot of fear around food, a lot of misinformation around food that, kind of bugs me. And I think instead of not saying anything, I usually try and speak up.
No, as you were saying that, have thought about that's a general conversation with me, of course. Being in the being in the food area, a lot of questions get asked to me about things, and sometimes I have to say I don't know. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not in the nutrition space, so I can't comment on it. I can more say about the functional side. But with that being said, I feel that food, especially now, feels more under scrutiny than ever before in terms of how the science is. And one of the things as a scientist that I struggle with, and especially when it comes to communicating, is that a scientist, we naturally more say, this study suggests, this suggests, or, because research evolves over time, it might change. I mean, we do have some that has a very, very strong indication of we should do this or we shouldn't do that. But how do you incorporate that with how you communicate with something? How do you communicate with something that science seems like it's not black and white and people want black and white when it comes to answering questions?
Yeah, I think, and I can't recall the moment when I first realized that science is not black and white, but I feel like that's what we're taught, right? We're kind of taught that growing up that it is black and white. So it's no surprise that people expect it to be. And you're totally right. The idea of hedging our statements to account for the nuance within science, it can be a frustrating way to feel like you have to communicate it. It can also be frustrating for people that you're communicating with, right? Because they want that black and white answer. So I would say that I definitely, I still kind of prescribe to that. And what I try and do is show people that the exciting part of science is the nuance that's there, is the black and white. Um, and try and provide examples of times where, maybe our understanding, for instance, with me, our understanding of food and health evolved and how that resulted in different changes. And for anyone who, lived through the 90s into today, you can see that in sort of like the low fat craze, and then it was low carb fat, craze. And
Mm-hmm.
um, so I think, we can understand and kind of tell the story of how our knowledge is shifting and we evolve with it. And for some people that's hard to swallow, but for the most part, if I'm showing excitement about the nuance and how it's made things better and how it helps us understand how to eat better, I typically get a positive response there, because it's you get to throw out like fun little facts here and there. You get to talk about the drama behind the science. And I think that that can reel people in a little bit more, and help them understand too that, we still don't have the complete picture. Nutrition science is not as advanced as we would think it should be for, 2024. We still don't have uh, like real recommended daily intakes for certain nutrients, right? Like a lot of our recommended intakes for sufficiency are still estimates for a lot of nutrients, right? And even more, we're discovering the importance of like the microbiome and things like that that add a lot of uncertainty to how food and relates to health. So I think that showing why you're excited as a scientist about this field and what keeps you interested in it, I think, and making sure you do that in a way that's approachable can really help draw people into why what you're talking about is important, and why, you know, unfortunately, there's a lot of gray area in science that we are learning to deal with every day.
I love how you brought the personality, and you didn't say it explicitly, but the storytelling aspect, because that's something I've been taught explicitly when I'm trying to communicate my science is tell a good story. It doesn't
Mm,
have to be a story that's storytelling connects one another, and it's an easier way to connect with different types of audiences, because if you can bring them through a journey with you, well, this was how my research started, this is, the idea that I'm trying to explore, and this is the climax, and then the follow-up is I don't fully know what the answer is, but that's okay, but we're gonna continue trying. So I like that.
yeah, and I think, another way to approach things too is, as you talk about this story, you talk about the type of data there is, right? So, especially when it comes to food and health, there's you can probably Google like the evidence pyramid, right? So you a lot of data, especially with food and health that's out there, is observational data. It shows association. And so trying to reiterate with people like this is a principle that, association doesn't equal causation. Um, so we the a lot of the data that is being put out there is very observational. And what it does is it shows you, okay, well, this is where we need more research. It doesn't show you this is what you should and shouldn't eat, right? We need multiple types of evidence to support these different recommendations. And so one of the elements that I try and incorporate into my storytelling when it comes to science is what type of data are these things based off of, and why is that adequate or inadequate at this time?
Oh, that's fun. That's a good, it brings to perspective in that. And sorry, when you had mentioned observational, for those who might not know who are listening, what
Mm.
would be observational data?
So think about like a large epidemiological study. So these are studies where they enrolled people in a study that, if this is a prospective study, so looking forward, they enroll people in a study and they say, okay, we're going to enroll these people and follow them for 5 years and measure all sorts of stuff about them and see and then measure disease outcomes and things like that. So these studies will look at, food frequency questionnaires, understand very generally people's dietary patterns, and then look at different health outcomes and look for those associations. So they're not actively intervening. So they're not giving people the food to eat or anything like that. These are free living people. But you're observing the associations there. So that's sort of the it's especially in food and health, it's not the most powerful data, but it does sort of help direct research in different ways.
And then at Ohio State, I would imagine that there's much more other studies that are being conducted that aren't just observational. Could you maybe elaborate on some of those ones?
Yeah, absolutely. So for instance, one of the studies that I'm actually a collaborator on right now, we're looking at whole wheat bread consumption and diabetes risk. And so this is a small clinical trial where we enrolled people with pre-diabetes. So they don't yet have diabetes, but they are at risk for it. And looking at if they consume white bread for 2 weeks, and we actually provided all the food for them for all their meals, I believe. So this is actually a really well-controlled study. And then, so they ate one treatment for 2 weeks, and then they switched to the other treatment, which was whole wheat bread, or vice versa. We randomized it, so you were consuming one or the other in different orders. But this is a study that there's lots of epidemiological, observational evidence to support, whole grains and diabetic health. There's some really mixed clinical results. So again, we've moved from looking at the associations to, okay, some studies have actually intervened where they provided the food for people and saw mixed results. And so we're doing it again, but paying more attention to the microbiome. And so trying to understand, does the microbiome play a role in whether or not people would respond or not respond as well to eating whole grain bread and their risk for diabetes? And so, again, science is iterative, right? You never answer a question with just one study. It has to be repeated. And typically, when you repeat it, you build on it. And so it shows sort of the type of evidence you need to do to build this case for foods that may have a certain health benefit. And in the end, it's likely more of a dietary pattern than single foods. But, there's all sorts of, epidemiological to preclinical, like animal studies, to clinical type of evidence that you need to build.
Wow, that is so cool. And as you speak, I realized that the microbiome discussion has really crept up on me, and it's just something I never heard about this except for Activia commercials were good for your gut, but now there's more to it than just eating yogurt, and that it may play a role. And it's interesting to see where this research is going, and it's really a cool thought as well that, coming back to your story and such, that if you wanted to go into the medical field, you don't have to necessarily go to medical school and be a doctor, that there's a lot of other areas. Where's the research coming that the doctors might explore? Well, it's coming from the scientists, and there's a lot of really cool things that we just don't know of that people can get into right now. And that's really exciting.
Absolutely. And I would say too, so and I still actually collaborated with him. I had a medical doctor on my PhD committee, right? So I was still working, even though I thought I wanted to be in that field. I even shadowed him when I was an undergrad. And I think I'm much happier now than I would be if I had gone to medical school, because I do like this side of things, but I still, like you said, get to work with them and collaborate with them. And they're excited about this type of research too, because it's super interesting, and it allows them to provide better care to their patients in the end of the day.
For people who are thinking about maybe going into becoming a scientist and maybe going to graduate school, do you have any recommendations about how to figure out maybe if you're this type of person, or what type of interests that would lead you more to being a scientist? Do you have any ideas?
I mean, I think the main thing, honestly, which was pivotal for me, was doing undergraduate research, and just getting exposed to it. Because I think, especially if you are able to take on, and maybe not right away, but if you're able to eventually take on more of an independent project as an undergrad, So I was able to do an undergraduate thesis. I worked very closely with a graduate student, so like under constant supervision, but I was able to have a little bit more independence in what I was doing. So finding that good advisor, that good mentor, and hopefully it also ties into a research area that you're interested in. I think that can be super pivotal. Um, and to be honest, I don't know. I might have ended up going to med school if I didn't do undergrad research. I don't know. But I think that just jumping in, not necessarily both feet, but you can kind of tip your toe in the water to say and get exposed a little bit. But
Okay.
yeah,
Absolutely. No, I have to
gotta do
agree.
it.
That's how I got into mine. I didn't know if I wanted to do graduate school. I had no idea. I ended up doing an undergraduate research project with, well, I'm still with him. So with my supervisor, Dr. Russo. So I must have really loved it. But I think it's a great opportunity. It helps you grow, become independent. A lot of the projects you do in school, at least with the sciences, you go to labs, you do your independent labs, and maybe you do a group project, but you never really get that opportunity to have your name on something, to work collaboratively, to that mentorship side as well, being under another graduate student. If you have a great
Yeah.
one, they can really change the trajectory of your life, because many of the things that I do today, I still remember because I was taught all the way back in undergraduate research. And I have to agree with you. It's a wonderful experience.
It is, and I didn't end up really doing my graduate work in the same lab that I did my undergrad work in. So, our labs had shared offices, and so I ended up moving the lab that we shared an office with because I saw what they were doing and wanted to do more of that. But that wouldn't have happened had I not taken the project I did. So,
Mhm.
you're totally right. It's, the best way to do it. You just gotta jump in.
Yeah. And as well, I mean, I decided to stay just because of the way that the stars aligned. And I really liked my project. I liked my research group and all that, as well as location. But, I think as well, it's always a good opportunity that if you did do an undergraduate project, that you don't have to also stay in your own graduate lab. You could also
Right.
go somewhere else. There's so many opportunities. Maybe funding doesn't work out where you want it to go or somewhere else. And even, just because you're in one area doesn't mean you're also shoehorned into that as well. Like there's, as you've been mentioning a lot, there's a lot of opportunity for complementary exposure to other types of sections, and it's a really good opportunity. I mean, undergraduate research has always been something I say this with everything: try co-op, try undergraduate
Mhm.
experience, just try to do as much as you can outside of your classes. I know that it can be really difficult. I know school is very hard. I know that last year of university was super hard for me, but getting as much exposure as you can. And you got highly involved with IFT as well during your whole schooling and that. Would you just be able to quickly talk about just maybe how that's helped you, and maybe if there's any other associations that you might recommend someone check out?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I owe a lot of my, excuse me, my professional development and like just general like ability to work to IFT. I feel it was such a great experience, it got me out of the lab, it got me networking with students at other universities. I was student association president, which was really cool because as student association president, you also sit on the board of IFT.
Wow.
And so you just get exposure to all levels of the organization that really represents the science of food. Now, that being said, I think if you get involved with IFTSA, the Student Association at any level, you can still make a lot of those connections, whether it's through one of their competitions, College Bowl, put a plug in for that one. It's a great one to get involved in if you have a team at your school. Um, but also like any sort of like leadership positions within IFTSA, you still do get to start building that network. And that network is something that I have relied on for advice, for collaborations, and just building my own knowledge. And so it really helps build your exposure to the breadth of the field and the people that are, that make it all happen as well. So I can't say enough about it. I would encourage everyone to get involved however they can. To this day, I'm still super involved. I lead my local section. I lead the LGBTQIA plus group that we recently formed, and sit on the scientific programming committee for the annual meeting, host their podcast. So like it's a lot.
I know.
They'll take as much as you give, but I do get a lot out of doing it. I feel like I'm participating in the field as a whole. So again, I think it's a great opportunity to get involved with them.
Well, I think I'm going to leave it on that note because that was a really good plug for IFT because I know that they're doing a lot of amazing things, and hopefully one day I'll get to go to the expo one day.
I hope you do too.
So with that, the last question I will officially ask though is for those who want to get in touch, where can people find you?
Feel free to reach out to me. My email address is Teegarden, teegarden.3 @osu.edu. I do have a website, mteegarden.com. You can find more contact information there as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, Matthew, for coming on the show. This was an amazing episode. I love talking science. I love also talking about other opportunities that aren't necessarily postdoc, but, still are within that research field. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
If you want to learn more about Matt or Ohio State's Food for Health, then check out the description below for additional resources. And make sure that you check out Matt on all the other places that he is. He has done so much, and I really wanted to dive into that on this episode, especially the science communication piece, but just didn't have the time. So thank you, Matt, for being on the show. Thank you to my team at FoodGrads for all the amazing work that you do and helping to make this show possible. And thank you to the listeners who are still here. Thank you, everyone, so much for listening, and I will see you next time.